Afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? That's a start, isn't it? Always a bit nervous around microphones. The older members of the audience will recognise Mike Nolan as the lead singer with Bucks Fizz. And I always have to resist the temptation to break into land of make-believe, which I won't do for you. I mean, I suppose the title of the presentation in part speaks for itself. I first became interested in family carers in 1984, I think it was, when I was a charge nurse running a day hospital for older people. People familiar with the idea of a day hospital? Yeah, it's essentially where people would come for a period of rehabilitation after being discharged from hospital. We typically have them in for about 8 to 12 weeks, give them a little bit of physiotherapy, try and get them back on their feet again. But what struck me very early on was that in addition to that, family carers who might be struggling to cope at home with someone, let's say after a stroke, were getting relief as well during the period they came at the day hospital. But of course, when we discharged them back home, all of a sudden the family carer had to pick up the pieces again. And I became quite interested in the way we did, or rather didn't, support family carers to continue what they do. And I've been researching in the field basically ever since. So 25-year retrospective will take you back a little bit from where I started, show you hopefully some of the things that have changed in the last 25 years. But one of the frustrating things as a researcher is things are very slow to actually change, and perhaps share with you some of the things I think still need to change in the next 5 or so years. And I always start off with some words of wisdom from one of the last century's great philosophers, Charles Schulz, mostly better known to you as the cartoonist responsible for Snoopy. Okay? He'll figure quite prominently, Snoopy that is, not Charles Schulz, in the presentation. So Snoopy tells us you can't discuss something with someone whose arguments are too narrow. And I think the thing that struck me when I first started working with family carers is we thought about them in a very narrowly defined way. And over the years we've tried to, if you like, expand our vision of what it means to be a family carer. And you can judge at the end how successful or not we may have been. And just by way of a little bit of background, won't be familiar to most of you, but the vast majority of people who need help to live at home are actually the older population. And you will well be familiar as well, that's the most rapidly increasing section of the UK population at the moment, particularly those aged 85 and over. And that's one of the great successes, really, of healthcare in the last century, the fact that the younger members of the audience might reasonably expect to live to 100, depending on, how much you drink, smoke, and whatever in between. But the chances are most of you will live well into your 80s. And for most of you, you'll live up to about 80 in good health. But once you reach 80, the chances of then getting serious and ongoing chronic long-term conditions increases quite dramatically. So there's no doubt that family carers are going to be a mainstay of government policy for the next 20 or 30 years. What we've seen shift in the last period is a shift from care in the community to a care by the community. In other words, it's the community itself who provides that care. And essentially, we're talking about family carers here. So the stats will tell us that the family provide about 80% of all the help older people need to remain at home. Paid but untrained or unqualified at least carers provide about 15%, and people who are in nursing, social work, one of the, if you like, caring disciplines, only about 5% of the support older people actually get is provided by trained professionals. And the figures vary, but the current guesstimate is family carers save the state well in excess of £100 billion a year, every year, which is far more than health and social care put together. So no wonder then perhaps that the government is interested in supporting family carers. Part of the challenge becomes, what do we mean by a family carer? It's one of these words we take for granted, and as Schulz points out, you can't really take words for granted. I never want to see you again, Charlie Brown, do you hear me? Never, never, never. Goes away, thinks little. Define never. And there are lots of words out there that we assume we know what we mean when we use them. Dignity is one, for example, that we bandy around readily in healthcare, but clearly the recent scandals will show us that we do not provide dignified care for a significant proportion of older people in health services. So what do we actually mean by a family carer? Here's the official definition taken from the Carers National Strategy 2008. A carer spends a significant proportion of their life providing unpaid support to family and potentially friends. This could be caring for a relative, partner or friend who is ill, frail, disabled, or has mental health or substance abuse problems, a definition. Little bit of a tautology though, actually. Basically what it's saying is that carers care. The real challenge is, what do we actually mean by the word care itself? And that's something that's, if you like, challenged researchers for a number of years now. Yaba Gubrium's one of the top gerontologists in the United States, and almost 20 years ago now he said, well, you know, what is this thing that some call caregiving? And that's really quite important, because unless we understand how family carers see what they do, we're never going to be able to provide the right type of support for them. And it has been said that we still tend to look at family carers in very instrumental terms. In other words, it's the washing, dressing, feeding, the physical aspects of care that are the focus of our attention, rather than the more broader aspects of actually being a carer. And that has significant implications, I think. Probably for me, one of the most interesting and complete typologies or ways of categorizing carers was devised by an American called Barbara Bowers 25 odd years ago now. And Barbara Bowers interviewed daughters who were caring for their mothers with dementia and said, well, what do you mean by this thing called caring? And she actually came up with 5 quite distinct types of caring, only one of which, instrumental care, the 4th one down there, the government actually looks at in terms of giving you services. So if you're going to get support from the government, you usually have to demonstrate that, you know, you're caring for someone who's perhaps incontinent or needs a lot of help with washing, dressing and feeding. These are the eligibility criteria that unlock support. But Bowers actually said, well, for these female carers, that was the least important and the least stressful aspect of what they actually do. She said caring has a natural history. It starts off with something called anticipatory care. Now, most of you, or many of you in the audience in your 30s or 40s, if you haven't already done so, will be beginning to engage in anticipatory care as your parents age. And anticipatory care is asking the questions, well, what would I do if mum had a stroke? Could I take her home? Would she have to go into a nursing home? And as your parents age, you engage in much more of this anticipation. And let's say, take a fairly extreme example. Let's say there's an only daughter who wants to emigrate to Australia, but she has an aging mother, and she says, well, actually, I don't think I can emigrate to Australia just in case mum might need care. Now, in reality, mum might never actually need that care, but a major life decision could have been made on the basis of anticipating some future event. My mum now sadly has dementia, and as well as researching this, I've been through these various stages myself. As people become a little bit frailer, and for mum, just starts to neglect herself a little bit, you begin to engage in what's called preventive care. So you try and put strategies in place that will enable, in my case, my mum, to allow living at home as long as she could. So you might pop in and see that the fridge is full of food. Now, all of this is invisible. You're not telling your mum you're doing this, because mum would have been a bit peed off, to be quite honest. She'd have been a bit insulted that her son was checking up on her as she would see it. And then, of course, as she became a little bit frailer, you had to begin to supervise some of her activities. So I'd go out shopping with her and say, okay, mum, let's see what you need in that fridge. I had a quick look, it looked a bit empty to me. And again, all of this is hidden. And I've got a sister who's a GP, another sister who's a pharmacist, and you can imagine that mum went through a lot of these stages with various ones of us in different parts. Now, none of those count as care as far as the government is concerned, but they're actually very stressful, and they're actually quite demanding on your time because you're constantly on guard for things. But Bowers actually said, well, the most important aspect is what she termed protective care. And that's protecting your loved one from their own vision of themselves as failing. So you actually put strategies in place to keep their vision of themselves as being an independent person. And we looked at this and we thought, well, yeah, that resonates with a lot of our own work. And what we did was, we developed that a stage further, a number of years ago, as you can see now, and Bowers said anticipatory care only is at the beginning of caregiving. And we actually said, no, we think anticipatory care goes on throughout the whole of caring. What changes is what you're anticipating. So eventually, and we had to, mum is now, I say sadly, but she's in a care home, we had to do a lot of anticipatory care about how long could we actually keep her at home, and when was it best for her to go to someone give her a bit more professional support than we could actually do. Because we all worked, we all lived away, and there was only so much supervisory care that we could put in place till she became a real risk to herself and life and limb in some cases. So we argued that anticipatory care actually carries on throughout caregiving. But we also said that as relationships change, you engage in what we termed reconstructive care. So you begin to reconstruct an image of, well, who is this person called mum? She's not the mum I knew when I was 40 years younger. She's not the mum I knew when I was 5 years younger. Mum is now a different person. So I visit mum once a week as a rule now, and I've had to reconstruct an image of what mum is. She's still my mum, of course, but she's a very different mum. Now, the extent to which you can reconstruct that image really determines how good a carer you become. The government pays no notice to any of that. None of that actually counts as caring, but in many respects, that's the most stressful aspect. So the first thing we wanted to do was say there's a lot more to caring than actually the physical aspects of care. But still today, in fact, it's primarily the physical aspects of care that will unlock help for you. So that's one thing perhaps to think about. I missed school yesterday, I had a cold. Must be something going round. Lots of kids have been getting colds. Mine was a lot worse though. Why? Because it happened to me. And of course there's an element of truth in that. But we've tended to look at caregivers in isolation as being a me, rather than actually carers as being as part of a relationship. Because basically no one cares for strangers, or very few people do. It's usually tied up with 40 or 50 years of history, of love, of arguments, of all sorts of different, if you like, patterns of being together over time. So what we wanted to do was build a model of caring that looked at how it actually changes over time, because again, some famous American researchers said that actually the type of support a carer needs will vary depending on where they are in what they term their caring career. And to some extent, if we're honest, we only really start supporting carers at a time of crisis. We're not very good at all in supporting them earlier on in their caring career. So we developed this 6-stage model of caring. First stage we called building on the past, which, as I've said, recognises that you come to caring with a history, and you have to take notice of that history. So let's say, for example, someone has a stroke, a husband, and the wife and the husband have always had a difficult relationship, possibly an abusive relationship. Things happen. There is something in the literature called the fallen tyrant syndrome, whereby when the shoes are changed, if the man becomes dependent on the woman, it can be payback time. Now that's relatively unusual, but it's certainly not unheard of. So basically, before we ask anybody to become a carer, we should be saying what type of past relationship have they had. We do that in child cases. If there was any question of a difficult mother-child relationship, we would look at that relationship and say, okay, how do we need to support this? Is it appropriate? We almost never do that in terms of caring. Recognising the need describes the phase of how you become a carer. So if you're caring for someone like my mum, who's had dementia, that develops over possibly 5 or 6 years. We suspected something was going on a lot sooner than most because we were professionally trained, we were looking for it. If you care for someone who's had a stroke, that comes on suddenly overnight without any warning. The types of help and support you need in those two circumstances are very different, but also often not tailored as they should be. And I'll go through the rest of these as we go along. So the problem is, as I hinted, is that as Carers UK have said, most carers only actually come to the attention of the system at a time of crisis. So we're almost there too late before we begin to offer some support. And our services tend to be reactive, proactive, rather than proactive and preventative. And there's a series of recent projects that suggest that still at this point, 25 years down the line, carers are still taking on their role relatively unprepared, without being given a real choice as to whether something they would want to do or not, and with very little consideration of the skills and resources they have to do what could become a 10-year part of their life. So we're still not timing our interventions correctly, I would suggest to you, at the moment. Let's have a look at this idea of working through it. This is the long haul of caring. And part of the difficulty has been over the years is that caring has been viewed almost as universally stressful. Virtually all of the studies of family care look at it from a stress burden perspective. The figures there, a bit old now, but they would be just as relevant today. The vast majority of studies of family care look at it as a stress burden scenario. And that's not for a minute to say that caring isn't stressful, but what it does say is there can often be moments of satisfactions and rewards. So one of the pieces of work we wanted to do was actually to begin to look at the balance between stress and satisfaction in a caregiving relationship. So this was a survey we did in 1990 of, I appreciate you won't be able to read all the small print, but I can go through it quickly for you. This was 2,000 carers. This was, I think, the biggest study of its time that had been undertaken in the UK at this point. And basically we asked carers, do you experience difficulties? That's the, it'll be your left-hand side of the diagram. Second column says, do you find these difficulties stressful? Because we can't assume just because someone deals with something that it is de facto a source of stress. Some people might deal with incontinence without any problems. For others, it would be a major source of difficulty. And then we said, let's measure their psychological well-being. And essentially, this is a computer-generated model. The bigger the arrow, the bigger the relationship between that set of factors and care and mental health. What comes out from this is the degree of physical care bears no relationship to carers' mental health. And this is 2,000 carers now, and they had high levels or low levels of mental health. They were a highly stressed population. The degree of incontinence bears no relationship, doesn't predict at all caregivers' mental health. So this begins to blow out of the water this image that it's the stresses of care are all physical. What really does cause the big, thick black arrows is a poor carer-dependent relationship. You're not getting on with that person anymore. Now, we know from job literature that you can work in a very highly stressed job and not burn out if you enjoy it. But if you work in a low-stress job that you dislike, you will burn out very, very quickly. So there are parallels for this elsewhere. So essentially what we have here is a much more sophisticated, we would hope, understanding of the sorts of areas where carers need support. We keep helping them with the physical aspects of care. What they really need help with are their relationship entanglements that they're experiencing because of their caregiving history. The next thing we did, and it had not been done before, we wanted to ask carers, well, you know, do you actually get anything back from this? No one had actually asked carers this before, so we were a little bit worried because we were sending this out to a random sample of carers with a load of stresses. And I was a junior researcher doing my PhD at this time. And I had this horrible feeling that carers would be sitting at home, not feeling stressed, and all of a sudden me sends them a questionnaire saying, look at all these things you might find difficult. And at the end of the questionnaire, they'd be suicidal. So I thought, well, you know, I can't live with this ethically. So what we did at the end of the questionnaire, we said, okay, you know, I've asked you about the bad bits. Tell us, please, if there are any good bits. Now, normally at the end of a fairly lengthy questionnaire, if you have an open question, people, you know, will either not answer it or will fill in a couple of lines. We were literally inundated with often pages of text telling us, well, actually, no one has asked us before, but we get a lot back from this. So later on, we did a much bigger survey with a different set of carers, and here's just some of the things that carers say, actually, this gives me a lot of satisfaction in my role. Now, in terms of intervening with carers, that gives you a second string to your bow, because not only can you reduce stress, you can seek to enhance satisfactions. In other words, you can make caring more enjoyable, more interesting, often in quite subtle and cost-effective ways. But this also gives us some indication of why lots of carers refuse services. Respite care is one of the most frequently requested carer services. It's also one of the most frequently rejected. And the reason it's rejected often is that A, carers don't think it maintains the dignity of the person they're supporting. They're worried about handing over that care to somebody else. And if they get one indication of bad care, they will pull out from receiving respite care. So understanding the satisfactions of care gives us a much more nuanced picture of what it's like to be a carer. We then went to look at different ways that carers cope. And what we found is that over the years, carers become very sophisticated at what they do, but they usually learn their coping by trial and error. And there are ways they could get to these ways of coping much more quickly, with a bit of professional help, a bit of support early on rather than later on. And again, I won't read through all of these for you, but the fifth one down there is very important, relying on my own experience and expertise. Often carers have a very strong sense of their own knowledge, their own intimate understanding of the person they're caring for. If we as professionals overlook that, carers by and large will overlook what we have to offer because we're not in fact taking their expertise on board. Sticking to a routine, establishing priorities. My toes still curl. As a charge nurse in a day hospital, we'd say to the carer, yes, we'll send an ambulance. It will come between 7:30 and 10. Yes, we'll bring your father home. He'll come home between 3:30 and 6. And that's the best we could do. Now for carers, that's actually worse than useless because by and large, their own routines are blown out of the water by that sort of thing. So we need to be beginning to tailor services in small but important ways. Managing meaning is very important in caring, and the top one there is probably one of the reasons that has most of the problems in caring. Realising the person is not to blame was the single most useful caring strategy that carers actually draw on. But the problem is in something like dementia, particularly in the early stages, people can be blamed for what they do because there's unexplained behaviour changes. And that would go for chronic fatigue syndrome, for example. It would go for multiple sclerosis. It goes for any condition where all of a sudden there's an unexplained change in behaviour. And if people get into a blame mode at that point, it can be very dangerous further down the line. So it's about helping carers understand what's going on here. And dealing with stress, keeping free time to myself, that speaks a lot again to the importance of respite care, the right sort. It's still a sad case that in the majority of cases reaching the end can happen broadly in two main ways. You can either place your relative in care or they will actually die. Now, what we don't want to happen by and large is people go in care. We keep the carer going. And most carers actually reach the decision to place their relative in care at a time of crisis. They haven't looked at what the alternatives are. They probably take the first or the second place that's available to them. Whereas we do know now there are ways of planning in advance. We can probably predict with reasonable accuracy a year ahead of time when someone's likely to need to go into residential care. That gives us a year to begin to plan for that. But by and large, we don't do it. And most of the research will still tell you that it usually happens following an accident or an acute health episode of some sort when there are pressures for hospital beds. And I think it's an indictment of a sense is that once the person the carer is caring for dies, carers get no further support beyond that point because they're not carers anymore. What does it matter that they've been doing this for 10 years and are possibly left bereft? So there's ways we need to build in carers' support much more effectively than we have. And as the last line there says, most carers actually are largely unprepared for what do you do to fill the space in something you've been doing for 15 or 20 years possibly. Back to Snoopy. Do you know what I'm going to build for you? An igloo. I think this will be just the thing for you during the cold winter months. There we are, old buddy, try it out. Not quite sure I see any advantage. Those of you who know Snoopy will recognise he always sleeps on top of his kennel and he's not going to change simply because it's turned into an igloo. So if we assume that Charlie Brown is the well-meaning nurse or social worker, come along, given Snoopy, who's a carer here, his carer's assessment, and planned a set of services based around what the professional thinks he needs, whereas in fact it's not what Snoopy actually needs at all. And there's still a lot of ways in which I think we can be much more sophisticated in working with family carers. And we've been using a model over the years called the Therapeutic Quadrangle, which basically says what you should be looking at is the interaction of 4 sets of factors. The sorts of services you can reasonably offer, what a carer might need, what the cared for person might need, but also the nature of the illness and disability needs to be taken into account as well. And it's about, therefore, involving carers as partners, as co-workers in the situation. And all too often, some of you may be familiar with Twigg and Atkins' very important piece of work now, going back 20 years, that says, by and large, service systems still view carers as resources. In other words, the reasons we give them help so they'll carry on caring. Where we don't view them as resources, it may be as a co-worker, as a co-client. But the dominant model, and I would suggest 20 years later it's still the dominant model, is we see carers as resources. For some time now, we've been arguing that carers should be seen as co-experts, people with whom professionals engage in a negotiation with. And we've been doing work in Sweden now for about the past 8 years, developing something that we call the Carers Outcome Agreement Tool, which is an approach to working in partnership with family carers, where you sit down and actually have an honest conversation with them and say, you know, we're not a bottomless pit, but we might be able to provide you with X, Y, and Z of what's available. Which would you like? Or if you're quite creative, as the Swedes often are, can we take money from this pot and put it in that pot to give you a service that perhaps we haven't thought about before? So, coming to the end, because I only had half an hour, I think we face some ethical dilemmas in the future. We all promote freedom of choice. We'd like to think we live in a democracy. If we're honest, we might want to ask ourselves, do carers actually have a real choice when they take on their role? So if your husband has a stroke, does someone sit down with you in hospital before you agree to take them home and say, well, yeah, by all means, please take them home, but this could be a 10-year commitment. Do you have the resources? Do you have the skills? Do you have the knowledge? Do you wish to do this, in fact? Because it will probably fundamentally change your life. And if I'm honest, I've seen that done a handful of times in several thousand cases. We just don't tend to do that. And then we also need to think about what will we pay for? And this economically now, and you know, today's recession becomes an ever bigger question. 64% of carers have never had any support at all. And of those agencies that are providing services to carers, the majority are actually cutting back on resources. And I didn't see it last night, but there's a panorama program on, I think, looking in fact at the looming scandal that's waiting for us in home care services unless we can get things right. So looking to the future, we've come a long way, but there's still a long way to go. Stephen Post, talking about dementia, going back to Gubrium's quote, said we need to develop an epistemology of humility. That means actually not seeing ourselves as the expert, but seeing the carer, and in Post's case, the person with dementia, as experts. We need to start to develop models of actually caring that look at the complexity of the dynamics of caring in much greater detail. And again, the older members of the audience remember the song, accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative. Yeah? Anyway, quite a famous song. I won't give you a rendition of it, but that's actually about looking at differing ways of intervening with carers that go beyond a burden-only model. It's about understanding those transitions, how we can help carers make them more successfully, and probably it's about more sophisticated ways of working in partnership. Interestingly enough, there are still many areas of caring, such as cancer caregiving, where we've only scratched the surface, really. So there's a lot more research out there. So I'll finish with Snoopy. My life has no meaning. Everything seems empty. Even my bunny books seem meaningless. I search the skies and can find no meaning. Food arrives. Aha, meaning. And the message here is that really caring means different things to different groups of carers. It's only by understanding what gives caring meaning for them that we're probably likely to provide the sorts of support that they will most benefit from. So thank you very much.